candlelight wavered against the silk-draped walls of Lady Rathbourne's garden pavilion, throwing trembling gold across Cecilia Hargrave's face as she stood motionless among the whispering guests. A moment earlier, she had been admiring the roses that climbed the trellised archway, reminding herself to appear serene, composed, untouched by misfortune. Now, however, her name drifted from lip to lip in murmurs sharp enough to shred the last remnants of her dignity. The collapse of the Hargrave investments, utterly beyond her control, had reached society's ears with merciless speed. What had been hinted at in quiet corners the previous week was now repeated openly, as though her ruin were a fashionable amusement. Cecilia felt the words cling to her like thorns. Penniless, unfortunate, reduced. Yet she held her posture with fragile grace, her chin lifted just enough to disguise the tremor that threatened her composure. She knew better than to defend herself. In 1817, explanations rarely redeemed a woman whose fortune had evaporated. Still, the sting of betrayal lingered, for many of those now delighting in her downfall had once begged for her approval at musicales and fittings. The shift in their behavior, so swift, so absolute, revealed the brittle allegiance society offered to any woman without fortune. Cecilia felt her heart hollowing, not with anger, but with a sorrow deeper than pride could mask. Only days later, she entered Ashworth Manor as the new lady's companion to the widowed Duchess. The role, though honest, marked her descent down the social ladder, and the household received her with attention she could not ignore. Some of the older servants bowed with polite restraint. Others, particularly those who despised change, regarded her with cautious disapproval. The Dowager Duchess, however, seemed unfazed by gossip or judgment. Her eyes, sharp but not unkind, appraised Cecilia with an expression that suggested curiosity rather than pity. Still, the young woman felt the weight of the household's expectations pressing upon her like a damp cloak. She must be perfect. She must be useful. She must never forget that she served now rather than belonged. The Duke of Ashworth made no immediate appearance. Rumor claimed he was away handling matters of inheritance after his father's sudden death. Society spoke of him in tones mingling admiration and speculation. A young man of 22, freshly burdened with immense responsibility, tall, reserved, and possessed of a stern beauty that made matrons sigh and debutantes conspire. Cecilia imagined he would return someday, glance briefly at her presence, and decide she was of no consequence whatsoever. That thought comforted her. If he ignored her, he could not dismiss her. But comfort seldom lasts. He returned on the fourth day, late in the evening, the manor's quiet broken by the sound of hooves striking the gravel path. Cecilia had been organizing correspondence in the drawing room when footsteps approached. She looked up, expecting a butler, and instead met the Duke himself. He paused, one hand resting on the polished back of a chair, and regarded her with a coolness that felt like a draft slipping beneath the door. His dark hair, damp from travel, clung slightly to his brow, and his coat carried the scent of rain-soaked wool. His presence filled the room in an instant, commanding yet distant, as though he carried his duties like armor. "You are Miss Hargrave." His voice was smooth but edged with formality. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, her hands folding together in an instinctive effort to appear composed. He offered no greeting, no polite acknowledgement of her circumstances. Instead, he studied her the way one might examine a stray detail out of place in an otherwise immaculate portrait. She sensed that he weighed not her character, but the potential danger she posed to his reputation. The knowledge pricked her pride, but she held her expression steady. "My mother has spoken of you," he said at last. "I trust you carry out your responsibilities with discretion." "I strive to," she answered quietly. Something unreadable flickered through his eyes before he inclined his head and left the room, his footsteps receding with measured precision. The encounter lasted mere seconds, yet it unsettled her more than the whispers at Lady Rathbourne's party. There had been no cruelty in his tone, merely a reserve so cold it denied her humanity. Perhaps he believed any fallen gentlewoman might cause trouble. Perhaps he believed she might seek to entangle him. She sighed, knowing her dignity must stand its own watch. The following evening, a storm rolled across the estate, rain slashing against the library windows like restless fingers. Cecilia had gone in search of a misplaced ledger when she found the Duke waiting for her near the hearth. His expression, usually unreadable, held something sharper tonight, decision perhaps, or unwelcome clarity. "Miss Hargrave," he began, his voice calm but unyielding, "your presence here has already stirred unnecessary speculation among my advisors. They question your place in this household, and I cannot risk the slightest hint of scandal. You will gather your belongings and leave before dawn." The word struck like a blow, yet she did not flinch. Her throat tightened, but she stood with quiet poise. "As you command, Your Grace." For a moment, emotion flickered across his face, brief, conflicted, before he masked it once more. The storm rumbled behind them, casting shadows across the shelves as though the manor itself bore witness to their parting. She curtsied, turned, and walked away with steps that did not betray the ache building in her chest. He watched her go, his jaw tensing, as though the decision he had delivered so coldly had cost him more than he wished to admit. Rain smoldered against the library windows long after Cecilia retired to her room, its steady rhythm echoing the resolve she struggled to maintain. She folded her gowns with deliberate care, though dawn still lay hours ahead. Each garment she placed into her valise felt like a farewell to the last fragments of her former life, and yet her composure did not break. She reminded herself that survival demanded restraint. One misstep, one display of wounded pride, would only prove the Duke's judgments correct. Still, beneath her calm exterior, a quiet ache stirred, for she had done nothing to warrant suspicion, nothing to justify dismissal. Her thoughts drifted to the look that had crossed the Duke's face, momentary, conflicted, and she wondered why a man so controlled would allow even a flicker of uncertainty to show. She descended to the library once more in search of a small book she had foolishly left behind, knowing the Dowager Duchess would miss it. The storm had softened to a murmur as she stepped inside, drawn by the glow of embers that cast a faint halo of warmth across the room. The moment she crossed the threshold, the Duke emerged from between the shelves as though pulled from the shadows by the sound of her breath. His posture stiffened upon seeing her, his hand tightening around the edge of a writing desk. "I believe you retired for the night," he said, tone measured yet tinged with something she could not name. "I had forgotten a volume I borrowed for your mother," she replied, careful to keep her voice neutral. "I did not wish to leave without returning it." He nodded, though the gesture seemed reluctant, almost uneasy. Cecilia moved toward the table where she had set the book earlier, but as she reached for it, his hand brushed against hers, an accidental collision of warmth and tension that halted them both. She withdrew first, but not before noticing the sharp breath he drew, as though startled by the contact. The silence stretched, charged and fragile. She lowered her gaze. "Forgive me, Your Grace." "There is nothing to forgive," he murmured, though his composure had fractured around the edges. "I should not have spoken so abruptly earlier." She looked up, surprised by the admission. "You acted as you believed necessary." "Necessary," he repeated, though the words sounded bitter in his mouth. He took a small step toward her, then stopped, as though he feared even proximity might betray him. The storm's dying rumble filled the space between them until he spoke again, softer now. "You must understand, rumor is a foe I cannot outrun. One breath of impropriety can stain an entire lineage." Cecilia held the book against her bodice, steadying herself against the flicker of vulnerability she glimpsed in him. "I do understand, Your Grace, and I assure you, I never sought to bring trouble to your household." His jaw tightened, yet something gentle flickered across his features, an apology forming without words. She turned to leave, granting him an exit from his own uncertainty. But as she stepped past him, the hem of her gown brushed his boot, and impulsively, disastrously, his hand rose to catch her arm, lightly, almost questioningly. She paused, breath caught, the warmth of his fingers burning through her sleeve. He seemed to realize his impropriety at the same moment. Yet instead of releasing her, his grip softened, as though relinquishing her felt impossible. She lifted her eyes to his, and whatever self-command he possessed collapsed beneath the weight of that gaze. He leaned in, hesitant, tormented, and before either could summon reason, his lips brushed hers in a kiss as brief as it was devastating. The moment shattered as quickly as it formed. He released her at once, stepping back as though scorched. A mixture of shock and longing shadowed his features, but he forced his voice into its former rigidity. "You must forget that happened." Cecilia touched her fingertips to her lips, still warm from the fleeting contact. "I will not speak of it," she said softly, though her heart thundered. His expression tightened with guilt, desire, and restraint woven into a single agonizing knot. "You should go." She nodded, gathering the book tightly and stepping out into the corridor before her own composure faltered. The moment she disappeared from sight, his shoulders sagged, and he pressed a hand to his brow, as though cursing himself for a weakness he had long denied. Morning found the household buzzing faintly with gossip, though none of it traced back to the kiss. Only to the Duke's stern decree that she must leave. Cecilia moved through the manor with quiet dignity, unaware that one of the maids, resentful of her former gentility, watched her with narrowed eyes and sharp ears. That maid had overheard fragments of the previous night, the Duke's raised voice, Cecilia's steady replies, and by noon, speculation had already begun to curl through the servants' quarters like smoke. Rumors seldom waited for truth. Before Cecilia could retreat to her room to finalize her departure, the Duke intercepted her near the stables, his expression drawn with restless conflict. He held out a small signet ring, his father's, unmistakably valuable. "You left your book in the library," he said, though the falsehood hung awkwardly between them. "This was beneath it. I assumed it was yours." Cecilia blinked at the ring, startled. "It is not," she said, though her pulse quickened at the significance of the mistake. His eyes darkened, the tension between them growing taut once more. "Then return it to me." She placed the ring in his palm, yet her fingertips brushed his skin for the briefest instant. A whisper of the previous night's forbidden moment. The Duke closed his hand swiftly, as though containing more than an heirloom. Words hovered unspoken between them, but before he could shape them, the rumble of carriage wheels cut through the silence, an unexpected arrival bearing news that would alter the delicate balance already threatening to collapse around them. The carriage that thundered into the courtyard bore the unmistakable seal of Parliament, its wheels splashing through the remnants of the night's rain as it halted before the manor steps. Cecilia stood beside the Duke, her breath held as a liveried messenger dismounted with brisk urgency. Though the man scarcely spared her a glance, she felt the tremor of consequence in the air. Whatever news he carried belonged to the world of power and titles, an arena she had been cast out of long before her fortunes fell. Yet she sensed instinctively that the message would reach into her life as well, pulling her fate further from her grasp. The Duke broke the seal with a decisive snap, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the contents. He folded the paper slowly, deliberately, as though steadying himself before speaking. "Parliament grows impatient," he said, almost to himself. "They expect the Ashworth lineage to secure its standing at once." Cecilia lowered her gaze, wishing she could vanish before he felt compelled to dismiss her again. "I should return to my packing, Your Grace." "Stay," he murmured, though he did not look at her. The single word carried an undertone that made her heart falter, not for its tenderness, but for its conflict. He inhaled sharply before explaining. "They mean to finalize a marriage contract, one that aligns with their political interests." The words held no triumph, only burden. He folded the letter once more, holding it in a fist that trembled despite his composure. "It appears I have little choice." Cecilia absorbed this with a quiet steadiness she did not truly feel. A marriage contract would end any question, any lingering possibility formed by one impulsive kiss. It would secure his position, his safety, his future, and she, already ordered to leave, would slip easily from his world, remembered, perhaps, only as a moment of imprudence. "That is welcome news for the estate," she said gently, though her voice felt distant in her own ears. He turned sharply toward her. "Do you believe I find it welcome?" She hesitated, meeting his gaze. "What you feel is of no consequence to what must be done." A shadow crossed his features, hurt, perhaps, or the echo of a truth he could not speak. Yet before he could respond, a footman approached, informing Cecilia that her hired carriage would be ready within the hour. The message, though respectful, sounded like a tolling bell. She excused herself, walking briskly toward the servant's wing before emotion dissolved her final shred of poise. But the moment she reached the side entrance, the Duke appeared again, breath misting in the cool morning air. He must have followed without thinking, driven by the same impulse that had led him to that ruinous kiss. "Miss Hargrave," he said, his voice more strained than she had ever heard it, "you should not leave so early." "My departure was your wish," she replied softly. "I honor it." "My wish." He stepped closer, frustration tightening every line of his posture. "I acted out of fear of scandal, not desire for your absence." "Fear or desire do not alter the command," she said. "You were clear." Her trunk stood at her feet, her cloak drawn tightly around her shoulders. In the pale morning light, she seemed both heartbreakingly resolute and unbearably fragile. He stared at her as though seeing the full consequence of his choices for the first time. "You must know," he said quietly, "that last night I lost myself. It should never have happened." She forced a faint smile. It was a moment of kindness, nothing more. His breath caught. "A moment of weakness," he corrected, though the tension in his voice betrayed the lie. The first drops of rain began to fall again, soft and cold. He glanced around the open courtyard, then guided her toward the unused music room before any servant could witness their proximity. The room smelled faintly of dust and rosewood, forgotten by the household but still holding remnants of gentler years. Cecilia stepped inside hesitantly, unsure whether she should remain. He closed the door behind them with a subtle care, as though protecting the fragile quiet they shared. For a long moment, neither spoke. The muted patter of rain softened the edges of the silence until he finally exhaled. "I fear failure more than anything," he confessed, staring at the warped floorboards. "Failing the estate, failing the memory of my father, and most of all, failing to maintain the facade of strength everyone expects from me." His voice lowered. "I cannot afford a single misstep." Cecilia felt her own restraint cracking under the weight of his honesty. "You have not failed," she said gently, "but you are human, Your Grace. You're allowed a heartbeat." He looked at her then, truly looked, and something inside him seemed to fracture. "That is the danger. When you are near, I feel it too fiercely." Her breath trembled at the confession, and in her hesitation, he read her truth before she could speak it aloud. Still, she found the courage to whisper, "That moment we shared. I will not pretend it meant nothing." He closed the distance between them by a single step, but before he could speak, the door burst open. Lady Evangeline, tall and immaculate despite the damp weather, stood framed in the doorway like a judge awaiting sentence. Her eyes swept the room, settling on Cecilia with thinly veiled triumph. "How very instructive," she said coldly. "I suspected impropriety, and here is my proof." Cecilia stiffened, instinctively stepping back. The Duke moved as if to shield her, but Evangeline raised a hand, halting him with chilling precision. "Your Grace," she said, "the scandal you dreaded has already been born." Her gaze flicked toward Cecilia like a blade. "Unless she leaves at once, your reputation may never recover." Cecilia swallowed hard, steadying herself. She understood instantly what she must do, what the Duke, in his torment, could not. "I will go," she said, her voice calm though her heart shuddered. "I will leave now, and no stain will remain upon the house of Ashworth." The Duke whispered her name in protest, but she stepped past him with quiet finality, offering her dignity as the only shield left to protect them both. A brittle silence settled over the corridor as Cecilia stepped past the Duke and Lady Evangeline. Her composure, so steady it felt like a final, graceful bow to the life she was leaving behind. Servants paused in their duties, drawn by the charged air, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and cold curiosity. Each step she took was measured, dignified, yet each one cut deeper than any whispered rumor ever had. She had always known her place in this world was precarious, but she had not imagined her exit from Ashworth Manor would feel like the slow closing of a door that might never open again. Behind her, the Duke stood frozen, his expression fractured with disbelief. It was not Evangeline's intrusion that stunned him, nor the threat of scandal she delivered with such icy satisfaction. It was Cecilia's willingness to sacrifice everything, including the fragile thread that had drawn them together, to protect his name. He felt it with startling clarity. She was leaving him not out of obedience, but out of care. Evangeline's voice broke the stillness. It is fortunate she understands her station. You cannot afford sentiment, not when the future of Ashworth hangs in the balance. Her smile held the brittle triumph of someone who believed she had restored order. The Duke turned on her, his restraint finally cracking. "Do not presume to instruct me on what I may feel," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "And do not mistake your interference for loyalty." Evangeline's confidence faltered. "I acted to protect you." "You acted to manipulate circumstance," he countered, stepping closer. "You always have." Her composure thinned, but before she could retort, he strode past her with sudden, decisive purpose toward the very woman he had commanded to leave. Rain battered the windows with renewed force as he entered the courtyard, following the sight of Cecilia's modest hired carriage pulling away from the steps. He did not hesitate. Without calling for a horse, without a coat, he crossed the slick stones and mounted the nearest stallion in the stables with a speed that startled the grooms. The horse surged forward, hooves splashing through shallow puddles as the Duke urged him toward the winding drive. The wind lashed at his face, the cold slicing through his attire, but he felt only the pressing urgency to reach her before distance rendered words impossible. He had spent weeks burying every vulnerable impulse under duty, yet now those impulses drove him faster than any obligation ever had. Cecilia's carriage came into view just as it reached the crossroads beyond the estate walls. The driver slowed abruptly as the Duke galloped ahead and signaled him to stop. The rain fell harder now, a relentless curtain that blurred the world into muted grays and trembling silhouettes. Cecilia stepped down from the carriage, her cloak darkened by the downpour, her expression startled with a mixture of alarm and something more fragile. Hope, swiftly masked. "Your Grace," she began, her voice unsteady. "You should not be here." He dismounted, landing in the mud with a graceless thud, utterly indifferent to the ruin of his attire. "Do not leave." The words burst from him with a rawness that defied every lesson of restraint he had ever learned. She steadied herself, lifting her chin with quiet resolve. "You know I must." "No," he said, stepping closer. "What I know is that I have allowed duty to dictate my every thought until I could scarcely breathe beneath its weight. But I will not allow it to silence this." He gestured between them, the space charged with the memory of their stolen moment. "Whatever this is, it is truth, and I cannot turn from truth any longer." She swallowed hard, rain tracing her cheeks like translucent sorrow. "If you speak this aloud, you risk everything. If I remain silent, I lose more," he replied, his voice fierce with conviction. "Let Parliament rage. Let society whisper. Let the alliances they value so dearly tremble. I cannot build a life upon an emptiness of my own making." Her resolve faltered visibly, trembling beneath the earnestness in his expression. "You would defy them all? For what we cannot name." "For you," he said simply, and the world seemed to pause. The driver discreetly stepped away, granting them privacy in the storm's embrace. Cecilia's breath broke on the edge of a sob she refused to release. "I do not wish to be the cause of your ruin." "You could never be," he said, reaching for her hand with solemn reverence. "But you may be the cause of my salvation." Her fingers curled into his, the gesture small yet monumental. It was the acceptance neither dared name, forged not from reckless passion, but from a quiet, steadfast recognition of one another's worth. Upon returning to the manor, the Dowager Duchess greeted them with a knowing gaze. She listened to her son's declaration without flinching, her expression one of weary wisdom. "Your father built this house on duty," she said, "but I have long believed it should be sustained by integrity. If your heart guides you as truly as your honor, then I will not stand in your way." Parliament bristled. Letters arrived bearing veiled threats, insistent urgings, and dire predictions. Yet the Dowager, formidable in her subtle diplomacy, tempered the storm with memories of the late Duke's alliances and the quiet influence she still commanded. Time softened resistance, and though the match would never be politically ideal, neither would it bring ruin. A year later, Cecilia walked through the restored conservatory, sunlight catching on the petals of newly tended flowers. She paused before a cluster of white camellias, delicate, quietly magnificent. The Duke approached, his steps gentle upon the tiled floor, and slid his hand into hers with the ease of a promise long fulfilled. "Do they please you?" he asked. "They do," she murmured, leaning into his warmth. "For they remind me that beauty may survive even the harshest winter." He lowered his forehead to hers, eyes softened with a love that had weathered judgment, doubt, and the relentless gaze of society. As did we. Outside, the world continued with all its expectations and noise, but within the conservatory's glass walls, a truth once forbidden had found its rightful home, enduring, unyielding, and undeniably theirs.